All right, this is Carmen from handmadescapulars.com, and today I'm going to show you how I make a plain brown scapular. First, I'll show you the materials I use. I have 2 pieces of brown woven wool. I've put a small embroidery on each piece here, so you can see those are ready to go. And to complete your scapular, you will need 2 cords. You can use 1 long cord, that's fine, but I typically use 2 cords. And then other than that, I've got my ironing board here. I have my iron. I use 2 rulers. I like to use a clear acrylic ruler for measuring around the design to decide how large I want my scapular to be. And then I use one of these thin metal drafting rulers for the ironing because the plastic can be warped by the heat. Finally, just some regular sewing materials. I have my brown thread, I have needles, I have scissors, and the last thing I use, which is maybe a specialty item, is this Dritz brand fabric glue stick. You could potentially not use this step or use regular crafting glue if you can't come across this stuff, but it has a lot of nice qualities that I find make this particular craft go faster and easier. So in the first step, what I do is I measure around the design that I've created. A brown scapular does not have to have a design or any kind of embellishment on it, but that's the fun part for me, so I almost always incorporate one. And in this particular design, I'm going to measure that it's about 1 inch wide and let's say a little bit shy of 1.25 inches tall. Whenever I make a brown scapular, I always try to make sure that it's very clear that the base material is brown. And so I want there to be space on either side of the design. In this case, I'm going to say 1/4 inch on either side, which would make it 1.5 inches wide. And then adding 1/4 inch up and down. That will make it 1 3/4 inch high. I could even go to 2 inches. But you can see that the piece of fabric that I'm using here is a lot larger than I'll actually need in the end. And I do that on purpose because when you're working with something really small and you're ironing it, you can get a much more precise line if you have a little bit of extra material. So I'd rather throw some of this away and have a very precise rectangle in the end. If you try to get economical and cut smaller pieces of fabric, you'll find you spend a lot of time ironing and re-ironing because the lines won't line up well. Also, the drafting ruler helps with this. But essentially what I'm going to do is fold in the edges and fold in all the raw edges and then fold the material in half to create the final scapular. And so in order to do that precisely and well and have them both match, I like to measure ahead of time, decide how wide it's going to be, how tall it'll be, and then use these rulers here to make it as precise as possible. So going back to the back of the design, I'm going to start by measuring 1/4 inch above the top of the center of the design, and I'm going to place my ruler in that location. Make sure it's lined up square. I'll slide the acrylic one out and snugly fold the woven wool over that metal and get a really nice, tight, precise ironed seam right there. Nope, the ruler's hot. So now I can turn it back over and say, yeah, that is in fact where I want it to be. Now, one question I often ask myself is, which edges do I want to fold under first. In this case, I folded under the top edge first. The difference it makes is that when the whole scapular comes together, the folded edges will meet at the top of the scapular. And depending on whether you fold the sides first or the top first, there will be a different profile along the top. Typically, I like to fold the sides first, just because I think it makes the profile on the top a lot cleaner. One reason not to do that is because if you want to insert, like I showed you here that the cord I'm using is actually chain. And when I sew the chain on, I always sew it to the exterior. But some people like to use like nylon cord or leather cord, and those they want to go inside. So if you wanted to insert your chain into the, or your cord into the top, I would recommend going ahead and folding along the top first. If you're going to attach your cord to the exterior, then not doing what I just did, folding the sides first, I think makes it cleaner in the end. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of iron that back open, and now I'm going to take a ruler out and measure the side again. So from that center point out 3/4 of an inch, and now up, I want it perpendicular to that first line. I'll place the ruler. All right, so I just ironed this the seam here on the left, and I turn it around and it looks the way I want it to look. It seems perpendicular to my design. And so now I'm going to do the one on the other side. So I'm going to measure here 1.5 inches wide. I'm going to try not to iron back over the other seam I made because I don't want to iron it back open. I'm just going to really stay on the ruler there. It's going to be hot, so I don't want to touch it. And here we can see that looks good. Now I can trim that fabric now that I have ironed it down. I'm going to iron that, press that seam one more time without the ruler in there. At this point I can trim off that extra length that made it easy to sew my seam down. Excuse me, I said sew, I meant iron. And once I'm done removing this extra fabric off of the sides, I'm going to bring in this fabric glue. It's a great product, but it does dry out a little bit fast, so I wind up going through it. Now I'm just going to put it on the extra edge there. Part of the reason I like this product is because it's not so damp that it will actually soak through the material. So I will get that nice precise line that I originally ironed down, and it will stay in place as I continue to work on the other edges. Right now it's hot, so I'm just pressing the glue into the warm fabric. I'm not bothering to go all the way down because I know I'm going to cut most of that off. Perfect. So now the next step I'm going to take is I'm actually going to do the bottom edge, which is a fold, and I'll wind up folding this in half. like that. It doesn't take a whole lot of measuring. I'll put my ruler down there. That's about 1/4 of an inch at the bottom. Line these things up with each other and press that. In the end, a brown scapular really ought to be rectangular in shape. So this is way more fabric than I need. I'm just going to cut that. Extra fabric is helpful to a certain degree, and then it becomes cumbersome. So at the end, I want my scapular to be 1 3/4 to 2 inches high. That's 1 3/4 inch. And that seems about right. I could go even another 1/8 of an inch and like that rectangle maybe a little bit more. So coming back inside, I'll place my ruler down there, and then I'm going to bring my metal ruler up to that line. I'm removing the plastic. Oops. Fold that over. Ooh, that's hot. You can see it keeps popping open. That happens because it's 4 layers of fabric instead of just 2. But coming back over here, I want to make sure that that looks perfectly square, and I feel that it does. And so that's when I'm going to come in with that fabric glue, which will help keep that in place. And as I go to try and sew it shut, everything will stay where it belongs. Perfect. And now this is the back. You can see it's a little bit too narrow in the back, but I feel like I can fix that as I sew it closed. I don't need to maintain all of this material down here, but I'll keep it there for the time being. So I'm only putting the glue right where the seam is, or excuse me, where the fold is, because I know I'm going to want to cut off some of that excess material so that there's less bulk in the scapular overall. But there, I've done one side in terms of the folding and ironing, and now finish the other side, trying to make it exactly the same size so that the finished scapular has that even look to it. So once again, I'm going to do the long sides first, measuring from the center of the design out 3/4 of an inch. I'm only going 3/4 of an inch because my design is 1 inch wide, and I want a 1/4 inch extra on both sides of it to frame the design. You should measure your own design. If it's wider, go ahead and make it more than 3/4 of an inch from the center. Making these long sides straight is really, I would say, the most important aspect of the ironing of these, because it really sets up the rest of it to have a nice shape. I've tried doing this without the rulers and without the glue and things like that, and what always winds up happening is that basically that the edges will shift and turn as I continue to work with the other parts of the material. So let's see how that looks. That looks just right. Do it again on the other side. Okay, so now in the second part of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I sew the scapular halves shut. The first thing I'm going to do with this one is to trim this excess fabric from the top and bottom. There's almost an inch of fabric in here, and I don't need nearly that much. And I don't want the bulk either. One of the things I'm going to do is come in from the side here and just trim it. I hope this shows up on the camera, I'm not certain. But now you can see it's almost cut like the flap of an envelope. And one of the things I want to show you with scapulars, one of the biggest challenges with scapulars is how small they are. If you go online and you try to look up information on embroidery or how to sew things closed, oftentimes you'll wind up seeing people work with something much, much larger. And it can be really difficult to try to apply some of those principles to something small like a scapular. And so one of the main considerations, and part of the reason I use the glue and the rulers, is that when you're working with something really small like this, it's really easy for things to get twisted. In all sewing, it's easy for things to get twisted. And, for that reason, I feel like giving myself a little bit extra to work with around the edges helps. And also, when it comes to sewing things closed, one of the principles for doing that with something small like this is that you don't want to just go up one side, around, and down the other, because often what will happen is that you will cause a sort of a twisting of the fabrics if they're not perfectly aligned. And so in order to avoid having that happen, what I always do is I will sew from the top points down with separate pieces of thread, and then I'll close the top with a third piece of thread. And the reason that is helpful is because these straight lines aren't going to wind up twisting anything. And once they're both established, then closing that top part, again, you'll avoid creating a sort of a tension all the way around the thing. So to begin with, I'm going to be sewing this closed by hand this time, and I'll probably just put that on double speed so you don't have to watch me spend all that time. But it can also be done with a sewing machine. I do it with a sewing machine about half the time, but I wanted to show something completely done by hand. That way anyone can do it. You don't have to have a machine. But also I wanted to emphasize that if you do choose to use a machine, still use these 3 separate sets of stitches instead of going up and around, because machines are even more likely to twist things. If there's any discrepancy between the speed that you're going at and the speed of the feed on the machine, like for instance, if you put pressure on it in order to kind of slow it down, the sewing machine is using 2 separate pieces of thread, one coming from above and one from below. And those can easily become sort of unequal in their tension if you're using your own hands to put pressure. And so that you'll really see the twist in that. And that's because this is so small. If you were sewing something larger closed, let's say you were making something like a placemat, a little tiny bit of discrepancy like that, it might never even show up. But when you have something so small that it's, the palm of your hand, then you start to really perceive it. And then when you go to attach it to the cord, it won't hang quite the way you want it to. And so now that's why I take this extra precaution of using 3 separate pieces of thread. So to get started, I like to come up through, you know, through this folded fabric with the knot already tied in my thread. And I'm just using one single piece of thread here. It's not doubled up like I might do if I was, you know, embroidering. And what I want to do on this edge, I hope that it shows up, but I'm going to stick the needle into the other corner and run it down the inside of that seam a little bit and then come back up there. And then I will come across to the other seam perpendicular to where that thread comes out and do the same thing, just a small channel, so that the thread is just, I hope you can see this with the camera, but the thread just comes across and it's perpendicular to the edge. And as I pull that tight, I can now skip across the top and alternate which side I do these very small stitches. Try to pull it taut with each stitch. And I'm just going over those flaps that I trimmed like I described as like an envelope flap, so that they are basically just tucked inside. They're not getting picked up in any of these stitches. It's really only that that exterior fold. And by going up and over the top, I completely skip over incorporating any of that extra fabric from what's inside. And one last thing I'll mention before I fast forward this is that a lot of people who wear sacramentals will have many things. You'll have many blessed medals, or you'll want to wear a Benedict medal and a crucifix, and you'll want to wear a miraculous medal and all these beautiful blessed medals that you have. And also sometimes you'll have a beautiful blessed medal that has tarnished over time because it was made out of, you know, some kind of mystery alloy that cost 35 cents, but nevertheless the object is precious to you. So one thing that you can do is, as you sew your scapular closed, you can put your medals inside of the scapular, and you know that it's there and you intend to wear it and you have it with you all the time, but then it's not, it's just not visible. So that's an option. It's in no way a requirement of a scapular to have any particular medal inside of it. Now I've tied a knot on the exterior of this, but what I want to do is to string the thread into the inside of the scapular. And sometimes you would just cut a thread, but if you can tuck it on the inside, that's even better, because it will just be that less likely to fray. All right, I stuck the needle inside and I've lost it. There it is. So now that loose end is just on the inside. And I will continue sewing up the rest of these edges here, and then the final step will be adding the chain. Okay, so now I have finished sewing these closed all the way around, and they're the same size, and now I'm ready for the last step, which is attaching the cords. For cord today, I'm going to be using this stainless steel chain that I picked up at the hobby store. I bought 2 of these. They're, I think, 16 inches long each, which is a typical length I would use for a scapular that I'm going to give to a man. For women, I try to buy 14-inch chains. And of course, it doesn't have to be chain. You can use pretty much anything for the cord as long as both sides of your cord match. When I use chain like this, it will almost always come with some kind of clasp holding it closed. I remove the clasps, and I also remove the jump hoops that are attaching the clasp to the chain. And I like to use the very last link of the chain, let's see, to connect the chain to the back of the scapular. I don't like using the jump hoops because they have, they can twist open. If you can see, I bent this one open. There it is. And the chain is fully closed up. It's not going to snag on something or pull open. So I don't have to worry about that if I just remove those jump hoops. So I'll try getting this one on. After I finished sewing the top closed on this particular side of the scapular, I just tied off my knot and then left the thread there. Oh, here comes the toddler. He just woke up from his nap. And so I'm going to sew that on nice and tight right there. It'll be hanging on the back of the corner of this one. Some people prefer to attach the cord to the middle, which is, it's perfectly fine to do it that way if that's your preference for how it should lie. I prefer having it on the outer edges, and so that's just how I do it. But there's no requirement for where it goes. You just need to have, it just needs to be put together in such a way that each side of the cord will lay over your shoulder, left and right. I've met some people who said that they will buy a scapular and then remove the cord and then just use like a safety pin to attach the scapular to the inside of their shirt or their bra or something like that. But in the legislation on the scapular itself, that practice is, that practice is forbidden, I guess you would say. It sounds like really strict, but it does say that the scapular needs to hang from cords that are draped over each shoulder. And so for that reason, I always attach a chain to every scapular. And I just want to mention it to you in case you've come across that or you've been doing it that way. You can take a look at that document that I'm referring to on handmadescapulars.com. Now when I am attaching a chain like this, what I try to do, I keep sticking myself, what I try to do is, hopefully you can see this clearly, but I will try to sew all the way around the open part so that there are stitches going perpendicular to the edge all the way across the whole edge of this. That way it will lay flat. There's less twisting and there's less pressure on any one stitch. I use a lot of stitches to do this. Now I've just put, I don't know if you noticed that, but I just put a knot in that last stitch. So as I come through, before pulling the thread taut, I will loop back around the thread to create a little knot there. That's the second knot I've made. And then I'll finish that off by stringing the thread back through the body of the scapular. And you know, I don't want to leave the needle inside, so I'll come back out the back here. The thread will come with it. But then if you just, see how clear that is to the camera, that the thread is just sticking out of the middle of the back of it. But if then you just cut that flush, then it will work its way back inside. Finally, I'm done attaching the cord to the two halves of the scapular. And I'll just show you the back of this so you can see how it came together. They're just, it's hard to get it focused, there we go. They're just stitched on. There's really nothing fancy about it, but hopefully that answers most of your questions about how to put a scapular together. And if you have any further questions, please leave them in the comments, or you can email me through the website handmadescapulars.com. Also on handmadescapulars.com you can share your work. I love to post images that the people have shared with me over the over the years. It hasn't been much. The website's a little bit slow to get going, but hopefully a video will help liven things up over there. And I look forward to hearing from you and seeing your scapulars.